A year of 1960. Summed up in a single day. Radio news, cinema highlights, hit songs, and the daily life everyone lived. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of 1247 Maple Street, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floors that Margaret Gallagher had polished to a mirror shine the evening before. The house held that particular stillness that only comes with Sunday mornings, a sacred quiet broken only by the soft percolating of coffee in the kitchen and the distant hum of Perry Como's voice drifting from the Zenith radio on the counter. Catch a falling star and put it in your pocket. Never let it fade away. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, still in her blue cotton robe, watching the milk truck make its slow progress down Maple Street. At 38, she remained the kind of woman who turned heads at church socials, auburn hair always perfectly set, green eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and a figure that bore 3 children without surrendering entirely to time. But this morning, her reflection in the window glass looked tired, worn around the edges in a way that powder and lipstick couldn't quite hide. The coffee finished its brewing with a final, satisfied gurgle. Margaret poured herself a cup in the good china, the spode pattern with tiny roses that had been her wedding gift from Robert's mother. Even on ordinary mornings, especially on ordinary mornings, she believed in small ceremonies that kept life from becoming merely survival. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked with the familiar rhythm of her family awakening. Robert's heavy footsteps in the master bedroom, the sound of his dresser drawer opening and closing as he selected his Sunday shirt. Always the white Oxford, always pressed the night before. Down the hall, Susan's lighter steps moved back and forth between her bedroom and the bathroom, probably fretting over her hair. That girl spent more time with her reflection than was entirely healthy, though Margaret couldn't bring herself to scold her for it. At 14, a girl deserved to feel beautiful, even if the world would spend the rest of her life trying to convince her otherwise. Danny's room remained suspiciously quiet. At 8 years old, her youngest son possessed the supernatural ability to sleep through everything from thunderstorms to his father's Saturday morning lawn mowing. On school mornings, it took 3 attempts and increasingly dire threats to extract him from his cocoon of blankets. But Sundays were different. Sunday mornings moved to their own gentler rhythm. Margaret opened the refrigerator, a pristine white Kelvinator that still filled her with a small thrill of domestic pride, and began assembling the components of Sunday breakfast. Bacon, eggs from the Hendersons' farm outside town, butter she'd churned herself yesterday afternoon while listening to Queen for a day on the radio. The ritual of Sunday breakfast was as sacred as any prayer. Each element prepared with the same devotion she brought to arranging flowers for the church altar. The bacon began its slow sizzle in the cast-iron skillet her mother had given her 20 years ago. The smell would soon wake Danny more effectively than any alarm clock. The boy possessed his father's appetite and his grandfather's sweet tooth. She cracked eggs into a blue ceramic bowl, whisking them with cream until they reached the perfect cloud-like consistency that made Robert close his eyes in contentment every Sunday morning. "Morning, Maggie." Robert's voice came from the doorway, deep and still rough with sleep. He stood there in his Sunday best, charcoal grey trousers, white shirt, and the blue tie she'd given him last Christmas. At 42, he remained the man she'd fallen in love with at a USO dance in 1943, though the war had left its marks. A scar above his left eyebrow from shrapnel at Normandy, hands that sometimes trembled when planes flew overhead, eyes that could go distant without warning, as if he were seeing something she couldn't, something he'd never quite learned how to leave behind. "Morning, honey." She rose on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek, tasting the familiar combination of Aqua Velva aftershave and the Pepsodent toothpaste he'd used since childhood. "Sleep well?" "Like a baby." The lie came easily, as it did every morning. She knew he'd been awake at 3:30, sitting in his chair by the window, smoking Lucky Strikes and watching the empty street as if expecting something to happen. Some nights she joined him in the darkness, not speaking, just sharing the weight of whatever dreams or memories had stolen his rest. But this morning, she let the lie stand. Sunday mornings deserved their small mercies. Robert poured coffee into his favorite mug, a simple white cup with "World's Greatest Dad," painted in slightly crooked letters that Susan had made in art class 5 years ago. He added 1 sugar cube, exactly 1, and stirred it counterclockwise exactly 7 times. Another ritual in a house built from rituals, small ceremonies that held chaos at bay. "Tommy up yet?" he asked, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. The Sunday Cedar Grove Gazette lay folded beside his place setting, headlines promising news of Eisenhower's latest pronouncements and warnings about communist infiltration in Hollywood. Robert read the paper with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else, left to right, top to bottom, missing nothing. Haven't heard him stirring. Margaret flipped the bacon with practiced precision, each piece browning to the exact shade of gold that experience had taught her was perfect. You know how he gets on Sunday mornings, probably dreading Father O'Malley's sermon about the dangers of rock and roll music. Robert chuckled, a sound that transformed his entire face from stern to boyish. That boy's got more energy in his little finger than most folks have in their whole body. Sitting still in church for an hour might actually kill him. Don't let him hear you say that. He's already looking for excuses to skip Mass. He's 17, Maggie. I was the same way at his age. Thought I knew everything there was to know about everything. Robert unfolded the newspaper with a crisp snap. Of course, that was before the war taught me different. The war, it was always there between them, that unnamed presence that colored everything Robert said and didn't say. Margaret had learned to navigate around it the way she navigated around the loose floorboard in the upstairs hallway, carefully, respectfully, acknowledging its existence without drawing attention to the damage. Footsteps on the stairs announced Susan's arrival. She appeared in the kitchen doorway like something from a magazine advertisement, blonde hair perfectly curled, wearing the pink dress with white collar that Margaret had finished hemming just last night, Mary Jane shoes polished to military standards. At 14, Susan possessed the kind of fresh-faced beauty that made older women sigh with remembrance and young men stumble over their own feet. "Morning, Mama. Morning, Daddy." She kissed each parent's cheek before taking her usual seat at the table. Her movements carried a dancer's grace that she'd inherited from Margaret's side of the family, though she seemed unaware of her own elegance. "Don't you look pretty?" Margaret said, meaning it. "That dress is perfect on you." Susan smoothed the skirt self-consciously. "Thank you. I was thinking, after church, maybe I could go to Betty Ann's house to practice for the school concert." Robert looked up from the sports page. "What school concert?" "The spring recital, Daddy. I told you about it last week. Miss Henderson asked me to sing a solo." The words tumbled out quickly, as if speed might somehow make them less significant. "A solo?" Robert's attention was fully focused now. "What kind of solo?" Susan's cheeks flushed pink. Just a song. Edelweiss from that new musical everyone's talking about. It's very wholesome, Daddy. Very appropriate." Margaret watched her daughter's face and recognized something she'd seen in her own mirror 30 years ago, the careful navigation between truth and what parents needed to hear. Susan had inherited more than just her grandmother's grace. She'd also gotten her gift for strategic omission. "We'll see," Robert said finally, returning to his paper. "Church first, then we'll discuss music." Susan's smile was relieved, grateful. "Yes, sir." The bacon finished cooking with a final triumphant sizzle. Margaret transferred it to a platter lined with paper towels, then began scrambling the eggs in the same skillet, letting them absorb the bacon's smoky essence. Sunday breakfast was an art form that took years to perfect. Each element timed to arrive at the table simultaneously, hot and perfect. "Where's our slugger bed?" Robert asked, glancing toward the stairs. "Danny, breakfast," Margaret called, though she knew it would take at least 2 more summons to actually produce her youngest son. At 8, Danny existed in his own universe of baseball cards, comic books, and elaborate fantasy games that could stretch across entire afternoons. "Danny, don't make me come up there." This brought the sound of rapid footsteps, followed by Danny himself, all elbows and cowlick, still in his pajamas, one sock missing, face bearing the crease marks of a pillow. He looked like a scarecrow that had been struck by lightning and somehow achieved consciousness. "Morning," he mumbled, sliding into his chair with the boneless grace that only children possess. "Good morning, young man," Robert said sternly. "Where's your Sunday shirt?" Danny's eyes widened with the particular panic of a child who has forgotten something important. I was just—" "Go get dressed," Margaret said gently, ruffling his unruly brown hair. "Eggs will keep warm in the oven." Danny disappeared upstairs with considerably more energy than he'd shown upon arrival. Margaret finished the eggs and began assembling plates, bacon arranged just so, eggs fluffy and golden, toast cut diagonally, because that's how Robert's mother had done it, and some traditions deserved preservation. The radio moved from Perry Como to a news bulletin. Eisenhower speaking about the U-2 incident, something about pilots and Russians, and the delicate balance of world peace. Robert's attention sharpened the way it always did when the news turned to matters of international significance. "Trouble brewing," he said quietly. "There's always trouble brewing somewhere," Margaret replied, though she felt the familiar chill that came with talk of war, of young men in dangerous places far from home. "Today's Sunday. Today we think about better things." Robert nodded, but his expression remained troubled. The war had taught him that trouble rarely announced itself politely. It simply arrived one day, unexpected and absolute, changing everything in its path. Danny reappeared in record time, wearing his Sunday shirt buttoned correctly and his good trousers, though his hair still defied gravity in at least 3 directions. Margaret wet her fingers and attempted minor repairs while he squirmed in protest. "Do I have to?" he whined. "Yes, you have to," she said firmly. "We're Gallaghers, and Gallaghers look presentable in public. But it's just church, especially church." Robert's voice carried the kind of authority that ended debates immediately. "Church is where we show respect, to God, to our neighbors, to ourselves." Danny accepted this with the resigned air of someone who has fought this battle many times and never won. He slumped into his chair and began attacking his breakfast with the single-minded determination of a boy for whom food represented one of life's primary pleasures. The kitchen fell into comfortable rhythm, the clink of forks against plates, the soft background murmur of the radio, the morning light growing stronger through the windows. Outside, Cedar Grove was coming alive with its own Sunday rituals. The Hendersons walking their cocker spaniel, Mrs. Patterson in her garden, already dressed for church but unable to resist checking on her prize roses, the Kowalski twins riding their bicycles in careful circles on the sidewalk, their mother's voice calling from the front porch in a mixture of Polish and English that somehow conveyed perfect maternal authority. This was the America that Robert had fought to preserve. Tree-lined streets and front porches, families gathered around kitchen tables, the sound of church bells calling communities together. It was an America that existed most fully on Sunday mornings, when the pace slowed enough to remember what mattered. But even here, even now, Margaret could sense the currents of change. The Hendersons had installed one of those new television antennas on their roof, a complicated metal contraption that promised to bring the world directly into their living room. The Patterson boy had come home from college with ideas about civil rights and social justice that made his father's face turn an interesting shade of purple during Sunday dinner conversations. Even the radio seemed different lately, more urgent, more aware of events beyond Cedar Grove's comfortable boundaries. "Tommy still not down?" Robert asked, checking his watch. Margaret felt the first stirring of genuine concern. Tommy was many things, stubborn, energetic, occasionally forgetful about chores, but he was never late for meals. Food ranked somewhere between breathing and baseball in his personal hierarchy of importance. "Let me check on him." She wiped her hands on her apron and headed for the stairs, her footsteps light on the polished wood. The upstairs hallway held the accumulated sense of family life. Toothpaste and talcum powder, the faint lavender sachets she tucked into linen closets, the indefinable smell of teenage boy that seemed to emanate from Tommy's room regardless of how often she cleaned it. "Tommy?" She knocked gently on his door. "Breakfast is ready, sweetheart." Silence. "Tommy?" This time she knocked more firmly. "We need to leave for church in 40 minutes. Still nothing. A cold finger of worry traced down her spine. She turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Tommy's bed showed signs of having been slept in, but the covers were thrown back and his Sunday clothes still hung on the closet door where she'd placed them yesterday evening. His dresser top, usually cluttered with the detritus of teenage life, coins and baseball tickets and photographs of girls whose names she pretended not to know, was unusually tidy. On the nightstand, propped against his reading lamp, was an envelope with Mom and Dad written in Tommy's careful script. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the letter. In her experience, notes from 17-year-old boys rarely contained good news. She thought of Robert downstairs, reading his paper and expecting his family to gather around him as they had every Sunday for the past 5 years. She thought of the careful balance they'd all learned to maintain, the delicate ecosystem of family harmony that could be disrupted so easily. She opened the envelope. "Mom and Dad, don't worry. I'm safe, and I'll be back before supper. There's something I need to take care of, something I should have taken care of a long time ago. I know this isn't what you want to hear, especially on Sunday morning, but some things can't wait for convenient times. I'll explain everything when I get home. Please don't call the police or Pastor O'Malley or anyone else. This is family business and I need to handle it as a man. Tell Susan and Danny I love them. Your son, Tommy P.S. Mum, I took $20 from the grocery jar. I'll pay it back, I promise." Margaret read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. $20 was a significant sum, enough for a bus ticket to Columbus or Cleveland, or any number of places where a 17-year-old boy could disappear into anonymity. But Tommy wasn't the type to run away from problems. If anything, he had a tendency to run toward them, sometimes with more courage than sense. Family business. The phrase echoed in her mind with particular resonance. There was only one piece of family business that Tommy might feel compelled to handle on his own. Only one member of the Gallagher family who had been excised from their Sunday morning rituals with surgical precision. Michael. Margaret closed her eyes and felt the weight of 2 years' worth of careful silence. Michael Gallagher, Robert's older brother, who had returned from Korea in 1953, changed in ways that went deeper than the visible scars. Michael, who had lived with them for 6 months before Robert's patience and Michael's pride, had collided in a way that left everyone bleeding. Michael, who now lived alone in a boarding house downtown, working odd jobs when he was sober enough, drinking when he wasn't, existing in a space between family and stranger that was too painful for anyone to examine closely. Robert had declared the subject of Michael closed, finished, not to be discussed in front of the children. They had enough problems, he said, without borrowing trouble from a man who had apparently chosen his path with deliberate determination. Margaret had accepted this edict, as she accepted most of Robert's decisions about difficult things, with outward compliance and private reservation. But Tommy was 17, old enough to make his own judgments about family loyalty and personal responsibility. And if he had somehow learned about Michael's current circumstances, if he had decided that the adult conspiracy of silence was wrong. "Maggie?" Robert's voice came from downstairs, tinged with impatience. "Everything all right up there?" Margaret pressed her fingertips to her temples and tried to think. She could tell Robert about the note, watch his face close down in that particular way it did when family complications threatened to disrupt the careful order he'd built around their lives. She could mention Michael's name and see her husband's shoulders tighten with the old anger, the old guilt, the old helplessness that came with loving someone who seemed determined to remain unloved. Or she could protect this Sunday morning, preserve the peace that had taken them so long to achieve, buy Tommy the time he'd asked for to handle whatever he thought needed handling. "Everything's fine," she called back. "Tommy's just having trouble with his tie. You know how he is with formal clothes. Tell him to hurry up, we can't be late for Mass." "I will." Margaret took a deep breath and made her choice. She walked to Tommy's closet, selected his Sunday shirt and trousers, and mussed them slightly before hanging them on the back of his desk chair. Evidence of recent use, of a boy who had simply stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. Then she closed his bedroom door and walked back downstairs, the letter in her apron pocket feeling like a small, warm stone. Robert looked up as she entered the kitchen. "Where is he?" "He'll be down in just a minute," she said smoothly. "You know how particular he is about his appearance these days. I think there might be a girl at church he's trying to impress." This explanation seemed to satisfy Robert, who returned to his paper with a knowing smile. At 17, romantic complications were not only expected but encouraged, provided they remained within appropriate boundaries. The Catholic Church had very specific ideas about courtship and young men Tommy's age, and Robert trusted that his son understood the importance of proper behavior. Susan looked up from her breakfast with interest. "A girl? Tommy has a girlfriend?" "I didn't say girlfriend," Margaret corrected quickly. "I said a girl he might be trying to impress. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" Danny asked with the literal mindedness that made conversations with 8-year-olds both exhausting and illuminating. "The difference," Robert said, folding his paper with authority, "is about 6 months and a conversation with her father." This sent Susan into giggles and Danny into confusion, which provided enough distraction for Margaret to finish cleaning the kitchen and organizing the morning's departure. Sunday Mass at St. Mary's began promptly at 10:30, and the Gallaghers always arrived 15 minutes early to ensure good seats in their usual pew, third from the front on the right side, where they'd sat since Susan was baptized 14 years ago. At 10:15, Robert stood and checked his pocket watch, a gold Hamilton that had belonged to his own father. "Time to go. Where's Tommy?" Margaret felt the letter crinkle against her hip. He's not feeling well, Robert. I think it might be that stomach bug that's been going around the school. He asked if he could stay home and rest." The lie came out smoothly, naturally, as if she'd been preparing it for hours instead of inventing it on the spot. This was the thing about being a wife and mother. You learn to make quick decisions based on incomplete information, to protect your family from complications they might not be ready to handle. Robert's expression darkened. "Stomach bug? He was fine at dinner last night. You know how these things come on suddenly. Especially with teenagers, their systems are so changeable." Susan and Danny accepted this explanation without question. They'd both experienced the mysterious illnesses that could arrive without warning and depart just as mysteriously, usually timed to coincide with algebra tests or piano recitals. But Robert's eyes narrowed with the particular suspicion of a man who had once been 17 himself. "I'll go check on him." "No." The word came out sharper than Margaret had intended. She softened her voice quickly. "No, honey, let him rest. You know how he gets when he's sick, all embarrassed and grumpy. I gave him some aspirin and told him to stay in bed until we get back from church." Robert studied her face with the kind of attention he usually reserved for complicated mechanical problems. After 20 years of marriage, he could read her expressions like a favorite book, recognizing the chapters where truth began to blur with necessary fiction. "Maggie, please, Robert, let's not make a fuss. If we leave now, we'll still be on time. And Tommy can have the morning to recover. I'll check on him when we get home." The moment stretched between them, filled with all the things that married couples learn to communicate without words. Robert's eyes held questions that Margaret wasn't ready to answer. Her eyes held requests that she hoped he would honor, without demanding explanations. Finally, Robert nodded. "All right, but I want to talk to him when we get back. If he's well enough to miss church, he's well enough to help me clean the garage this afternoon." "Of course." Margaret gathered her purse and checked her appearance in the hallway mirror. Lipstick fresh, hair properly arranged beneath the small black hat that she wore only to Sunday Mass. She looked like exactly what she was, a respectable Catholic wife and mother, someone who understood the importance of maintaining appearances and preserving family harmony. Behind her reflection, she could see Robert helping Danny with his jacket, while Susan checked her own appearance with the kind of critical attention that teenage girls brought to their eternal quest for perfection. They looked like the kind of family that belonged on magazine covers, wholesome, attractive, properly dressed for Sunday worship. If only magazine families had to deal with missing sons and family secrets, and the terrible complexity of loving people who couldn't seem to love themselves. The walk to St. Mary's Catholic Church took exactly 12 minutes, following the same route the Gallagher family had traced every Sunday for the past 5 years. Down Maple Street to Elm, then 2 blocks north to the corner where the church sat like a red brick fortress against the uncertainties of modern life. The morning air carried the mixed scents of late spring, lilacs blooming in front yards, fresh-cut grass, and the faint industrial smell that drifted over from the manufacturing district when the wind was right. Other families moved along the sidewalks in the same direction, creating a gentle stream of Sunday-best clothing and carefully groomed children. The Hendersons with their Cocker Spaniel, the Kowalski twins, now walking sedately beside their parents instead of racing their bicycles. Mrs. Patterson, elegant in navy blue, carrying a small bouquet of roses from her prized garden. This was the cedar grove that appeared in the Chamber of Commerce brochures, a community where neighbors knew each other's names, where children played safely in tree-lined streets, where families gathered weekly to affirm their shared values and collective faith. It was an America that felt solid, permanent, blessed by prosperity and protected by geographic distance from the world's more complicated problems. But Margaret walked through this familiar landscape with new awareness, seeing it through the lens of Tommy's absence and the letter in her pocket. Every family they passed might be harboring its own secrets, its own complicated loyalties, its own members who didn't quite fit the Sunday morning picture of respectability and order. "Morning, Robert." "Margaret." Bill Henderson fell into step beside them, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness that men used when they weren't quite sure what to talk about. "Beautiful day for worship." "Morning, Bill," Robert replied. "How's business?" "Can't complain. Factory's running 3 shifts now trying to keep up with orders. You know how it is. Everybody wants a new car these days." Robert nodded knowingly. He understood the rhythms of American manufacturing, the way prosperity flowed through communities like Cedar Grove, in visible, measurable ways. More cars meant more jobs, which meant more families, which meant more houses and schools and churches. It was a system that made sense, that rewarded hard work and careful planning. "Of course, there's talk about automation," Bill continued, his voice dropping slightly. "Machines doing work that used to take men. Makes you wonder what the future holds for fellows like us." This was the other conversation that ran beneath Sunday morning pleasantries, the quiet anxiety about change, about the shifting ground beneath America's feet, television bringing the world into living rooms, teenagers listening to music that their parents couldn't understand, young people questioning assumptions that had seemed unshakable just a few years ago. "Change comes whether we're ready for it or not," Robert said philosophically. "The trick is holding on to what matters while we figure out how to deal with what's new." Margaret listened to this exchange with part of her attention while scanning the street ahead for any sign of Tommy. Ridiculous, of course, he wouldn't be walking to church when he'd specifically left a note explaining his absence. But maternal worry operated according to its own logic, creating scenarios and possibilities that had nothing to do with rational analysis. Susan walked beside her mother with unusual quietness, her attention focused inward in that way that teenage girls had when they were processing something important. She'd been doing that more often lately, retreating into private contemplation, emerging with questions that suggested she was thinking about things beyond Cedar Grove's comfortable boundaries. "Mama," she said softly, timing her words so that Robert and Bill Henderson wouldn't overhear, "do you ever wonder what life would be like if you'd made different choices?" The question hit Margaret with unexpected force. At 38, she was still young enough to remember the dreams she'd held at Susan's age, old enough to understand the distance between those dreams and her current reality. "What kind of different choices, sweetheart?" Susan's cheeks flushed pink. "I don't know. Just different. Like, what if you'd wanted to be something other than a wife and mother? What if you'd wanted to travel or have a career or sing in nightclubs or something?" Margaret almost smiled at the exotic nature of Susan's example. Nightclub singing represented the absolute pinnacle of worldly sophistication in her 14-year-old imagination, the kind of glamorous life that existed only in movies and magazine articles. "Well," Margaret said carefully, "I suppose every woman wonders about roads not taken, but wondering isn't the same as regretting. I love being your mother and your father's wife and making a home for our family. That's not settling for less. That's choosing what makes me happy. But what if singing in nightclubs would have made you happier?" The question hung in the air between them, complicated by everything Susan didn't know about her mother's past. Margaret had indeed possessed dreams that extended beyond domestic contentment. She'd had a voice that could fill a room with golden light, had won talent competitions in 3 counties before she met Robert at that USO dance. She'd been offered a scholarship to a music conservatory in Cincinnati, had spent sleepless nights imagining herself on stages that extended far beyond Cedar Grove's comfortable boundaries. But then the war ended, and Robert came home carrying his own dreams of normalcy and family, and the choice had presented itself with crystalline clarity: pursue her individual ambitions or build something larger than herself with the man she loved. The thing about happiness, sweetheart, is that it's not a destination you arrive at and stay forever. It's something you choose every day based on who you are and what you value most. Margaret adjusted her purse strap and chose her words carefully. Some women find happiness in careers and travel and independence. Other women find it in family and community, and the kind of love that builds something lasting. Neither choice is wrong, but you can't make both choices at once. Susan absorbed this with the serious attention she brought to important subjects. "But how do you know which choice is right for you?" You don't completely. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and then you commit to making that decision work. You don't spend your life looking backward and wondering, what if? This was the wisdom that Margaret had spent 20 years learning, the hard-earned understanding that contentment came not from having unlimited options, but from choosing your limitations consciously and then pouring your energy into making the most of what you'd chosen. But even as she spoke, she felt Tommy's letter crinkle against her hip, a reminder that sometimes the choices you made to protect your family required their own complicated navigation between truth and necessary deception. They reached the church steps just as the bells began their 10-minute warning. St. Mary's Catholic Church rose before them like a promise made in red brick and stained glass, its twin spires reaching toward a sky that was the particular blue that only appeared on perfect spring mornings. The massive oak doors stood open, revealing the cool interior where hundreds of candles flickered like earthbound stars. Margaret paused at the threshold, momentarily overwhelmed by the familiar combination of incense, beeswax, and the indefinable scent of collective faith. This was where Tommy had been baptized, where Susan had received her first communion, where Danny would soon begin his own formal journey toward confirmation and adult membership in the community of believers. This was also where she had married Robert 20 years ago, promising to love and honor him in good times and bad, in sickness and health, for richer and poorer. Promises that had seemed simple then, but had proven to require constant renegotiation as life revealed its talent for complicating even the most straightforward commitments. "You coming, Maggie?" Robert's voice brought her back to the present moment. He stood holding the door, his face patient but expectant. "Of course." She smiled and stepped across the threshold, carrying Tommy's secret with her, into the sacred space where honesty was supposed to be absolute and families were supposed to present their most authentic selves to God and community. The next hour would test her ability to maintain the performance of normalcy, while her mind raced through possibilities and scenarios. But this too was part of being a wife and mother, learning to hold multiple realities simultaneously, to protect your family's privacy while participating fully in community rituals that demanded transparency. As they walked down the center aisle toward their usual pew, Margaret caught sight of Father O'Malley arranging his sermon notes at the altar. A thin, intense man in his 50s, he possessed the kind of piercing gaze that seemed capable of detecting sins that hadn't been committed yet. His sermons tended toward warnings about the moral dangers of modern life, rock music, television, the growing tendency of young people to question traditional authority. This morning, of all mornings, Father O'Malley's scrutiny felt particularly unwelcome. Margaret slid into the pew beside Robert, arranged her skirt carefully, and tried to look like a woman whose Sunday morning held no complications beyond deciding what to prepare for Sunday dinner. But underneath the familiar rituals of standing and sitting and reciting prayers that she'd memorized in childhood, her mind kept returning to Tommy and the $20 missing from the grocery jar and the question of what family business could be urgent enough to risk Robert's anger. The service proceeded with its usual rhythm, but Margaret found herself distracted by the empty space where Tommy should have been sitting. She caught herself glancing toward the church doors, hoping to see his familiar figure slipping in late with an apologetic grin. Instead, she saw only the steady stream of latecomers finding seats in the back pews, families whose own Sunday morning routines had been disrupted by overslept alarm clocks or misplaced shoes, or the thousand small crises that could derail even the most carefully planned schedules. When it came time for communion, Margaret rose with the rest of the congregation and joined the slow procession toward the altar. The ritual of receiving the host required a specific state of spiritual preparation. The Catholic Church had very clear teachings about approaching communion with a clear conscience and pure intentions. But as she knelt at the altar rail and felt the thin wafer dissolve on her tongue, Margaret found herself praying not for forgiveness, but for wisdom, for the strength to protect her family from complications they might not be ready to handle, for Tommy's safety, wherever he was and whatever he thought he needed to accomplish, for the grace to navigate the afternoon's inevitable questions and explanations without destroying the carefully maintained peace that had taken them so long to achieve. When the service ended and the congregation began its slow exodus into the sunshine, Margaret felt as if she'd survived some kind of test. She'd maintained the appearance of devout attention while her mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. She'd participated fully in the communal rituals while harboring private knowledge that couldn't be shared. She'd preserved her family's reputation while protecting their privacy. But the most difficult part of the day still lay ahead: the return home, the moment when Robert would expect to find Tommy recovered and ready for the kind of father-son conversation that served as both punishment and reconciliation. "Beautiful service," she said to Robert as they walked down the church steps into the morning sunshine. "Father O'Malley certainly didn't pull any punches about the moral dangers of modern music," Robert replied. "Makes you think about what our kids are listening to when we're not paying attention." Susan rolled her eyes with the practiced exasperation of a teenager whose musical tastes had been publicly questioned. "Daddy, I listened to Pat Boone and Perry Como. How dangerous could that be?" "It's not Pat Boone I'm worried about, sweetheart. It's that, what do they call it? Rock and roll music. Elvis Presley and those other fellows with their hip-swiveling and suggestive lyrics." Margaret suppressed a smile at Robert's description of rock and roll's moral hazards. Her husband's concerns about modern music reflected the same anxieties that Father O'Malley had explored in his sermon: the fear that young people were being exposed to influences that might corrupt their character or lead them away from traditional values. But she also remembered being 18 and dancing to swing music that her own parents had considered dangerously passionate. Every generation seemed to produce music that scandalized their elders while providing the soundtrack for young people's coming of age. "I think Susan has good judgment about music," she said diplomatically, "and about most things." This earned her a grateful smile from her daughter, who was clearly relieved to have maternal support in the eternal battle between teenage autonomy and parental oversight. The walk home passed pleasantly enough, with Danny chattering about the baseball cards he planned to trade with the Morrison boy that afternoon, and Susan humming fragments of the hymns they'd sung in church. But as they turned onto Maple Street and their house came into view, Margaret felt her anxiety return with renewed intensity. "I'll go check on Tommy," Robert announced as soon as they reached the front porch. "See if he's feeling well enough to join us for dinner." "Maybe I should," Margaret began, but Robert was already climbing the stairs with the determined stride of a man who had postponed a necessary conversation long enough. She stood in the front hallway, listening to his footsteps cross the upstairs floor, then stop outside Tommy's door. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds before she heard the doorknob turn and Robert's voice calling Tommy's name. Then, nothing. A pause that seemed to hold the entire house's breath. "Maggie!" Robert's voice carried a tone she recognized from the war stories he'd told: sharp, controlled, demanding immediate response. "Could you come up here, please?" Susan looked up from where she was hanging her good dress in the front closet. "Is Tommy worse?" "I'm sure he's fine, sweetheart. Why don't you help Danny change out of his church clothes while I go see what your father needs?" Margaret climbed the stairs with legs that felt suddenly heavy, each step bringing her closer to the moment when careful lies would collide with undeniable reality. Robert stood in Tommy's doorway, holding himself with the rigid posture that indicated either extreme anger or extreme control. "Where is he, Maggie?" She joined him in the doorway, looking at Tommy's empty room as if seeing it for the first time. The mussed bedsheets she'd arranged to suggest recent occupation. The Sunday clothes draped over the desk chair, the conspicuous absence of the boy who should have been there. I don't know. Don't know." Robert's voice remained quiet, but Margaret recognized the dangerous calm that preceded explosions. "You told me he was sick. You told me he was staying home to rest. He was. I thought he was." "Maggie." Robert turned to face her fully, his eyes holding the kind of focused intensity that made grown men step back during factory disputes. "Where is my son?" The moment stretched between them like a bridge that could either hold their weight or collapse entirely. 20 years of marriage had taught Margaret when to fight and when to surrender, when to maintain protective fictions, and when truth became the only viable option. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew Tommy's letter. Robert read it twice, his face cycling through emotions too complex for easy identification. Anger, certainly, but also hurt, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Family business," he said finally. What family business could a 17-year-old boy possibly need to handle on his own? Margaret met his eyes and spoke the name that had been forbidden in their house for 2 years. Michael. The effect was immediate and devastating. Robert's face went white, then flushed red, then settled into the kind of controlled blankness that indicated emotions too powerful for expression. No. His voice was flat, final. Michael made his choices. We don't owe him anything more. Tommy doesn't know about your choices, Robert. He only knows his uncle is family, and family doesn't abandon family. Michael abandoned us. He chose drinking over responsibility, chose self-pity over healing, chose to wallow in whatever demons he brought back from Korea instead of fighting to get better. Robert's voice rose with each accusation, years of suppressed anger and guilt spilling out like water from a broken dam. He was hurt, Robert, damaged in ways we couldn't see or understand. We were all damaged. I came back from Normandy with my own scars, my own nightmares, but I didn't use them as an excuse to destroy everyone who tried to help me. Robert crumpled Tommy's letter in his fist, then smoothed it out again with hands that trembled slightly. I tried, Maggie. God knows I tried. I brought him into our home, gave him work at the factory, sat up nights listening to his stories about Korea and what he'd seen over there. But he threw it all away for a bottle of whiskey and a righteous anger that he wore like a badge of honor. Margaret had heard this justification before, during the terrible months when Michael had lived with them, and the house had felt like a battleground between two brothers who loved each other too much to give up and too little to forgive each other's failures. Tommy doesn't know any of that. He remembers Uncle Michael teaching him to throw a curveball, Uncle Michael sneaking him extra dessert when we weren't looking, Uncle Michael reading him bedtime stories in different voices. Tommy was 13 when Michael left. He's 17 now. Old enough to understand that some people can't be saved no matter how much you love them. Is he? Are you sure about that? Margaret's voice carried its own edge now. The accumulated frustration of 2 years spent navigating around a subject too painful for direct discussion. Because it seems to me that Tommy is exactly the age when boys think they can fix everything and save everyone, especially when the adults in their lives have given up trying. Robert stared at the letter in his hands, reading Tommy's words again, as if hoping they might say something different this time. $20. Where would he go with $20? The boarding house on 5th Street, where Michael lives now. You know where he lives. Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, felt the careful structure of family harmony beginning to crack along fault lines that had been hidden for years. I've always known where he lives, Robert. He's your brother, our children's uncle. Did you really think I would let him disappear completely? You've been. Robert's voice failed him temporarily. You've been in contact with him. Not contact exactly, but I've kept track, made sure he had enough to eat, that he wasn't sleeping in doorways or worse. Margaret lifted her chin with the defiant pride of someone who had been forced to choose between her husband's anger and her own conscience. Someone had to care what happened to him. Behind my back. You've been helping him behind my back. I've been protecting you from having to make a choice you weren't ready to make. The words hung in the air between them, like an accusation neither of them was prepared to address directly. Downstairs, they could hear Susan and Danny moving around, their voices carrying the casual cheerfulness of children who assumed the adult world would continue to function with predictable stability. Robert walked to Tommy's window and stared out at Maple Street, where other families were settling into their Sunday afternoon routines. Lawn mowing and newspaper reading, and the 1,000 small rituals that marked the passage of time in communities like Cedar Grove. What's his condition? He asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. Margaret joined him at the window, standing close enough to feel the warmth of his body but not quite touching. This was the conversation they should have had 2 years ago, before pride and hurt had hardened into positions neither of them knew how to abandon. Bad, I think. Worse than when he left here. The drinking is significant. And there may be other problems. Medical problems that he's not taking care of because he doesn't have the money or the insurance or the... She paused, searching for the right word. The hope. Robert's jaw tightened. How bad? I don't know exactly. But bad enough that Tommy felt he needed to do something about it. Bad enough that a 17-year-old boy was willing to risk your anger to try to help. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the Sunday afternoon peace of their neighborhood, while grappling with the reality that their family's carefully maintained equilibrium was about to be disrupted in ways they couldn't predict or control. He could have come to us, Robert said finally. Tommy, I mean. He could have told us about Michael's situation, asked for help instead of sneaking out like a... Like a what? Like a boy who's been taught that his uncle's name can't be spoken in this house? Like a teenager who's learned that some family problems are too complicated for honest discussion? Robert turned to look at her, his eyes holding a mixture of hurt and recognition. Is that what you think? That I've forbidden honest discussion? I think you've been protecting yourself and all of us from a pain that felt too big to handle. But protection and avoidance aren't the same thing, and sometimes the things we don't talk about become more powerful than the things we do. Before Robert could respond, they heard the front door open downstairs, followed by familiar footsteps in the hallway. Tommy's voice, calling out with the careful cheerfulness of someone who hoped to minimize the inevitable confrontation. "I'm home! Sorry I'm late." Margaret and Robert looked at each other, a lifetime of marital communication passing between them in a single glance. Whatever happened next would determine not just Tommy's immediate fate, but the future dynamics of their family's ability to handle crisis and complexity together. "We'll continue this later," Robert said quietly. "Yes, we will." They walked downstairs together, presenting a united front that concealed the fault lines that had just opened between them. Tommy stood in the living room still wearing his good clothes, but they were wrinkled and bore stains that suggested he'd spent the morning somewhere that Sunday-best attire wasn't entirely appropriate. "Where have you been?" Robert's voice was controlled, but carried an undercurrent that made Tommy straighten unconsciously. I went to see Uncle Michael." The words seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Susan, who had been arranging flowers in a vase on the mantelpiece, froze with a daisy halfway to its destination. Danny looked up from his comic book with the alert expression of someone who sensed adult drama brewing, but couldn't quite identify its source. "Uncle Michael?" Susan's voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes darted between her parents' faces, reading the complex emotions that flickered there. "You remember Uncle Michael?" Tommy said with the patient tone of an older brother explaining something obvious. "Dad's brother. He lived with us for a while when I was in 8th grade." "I remember," Susan said slowly. "He used to make those funny voices when he read stories." "He's been sick," Tommy continued, his attention focused on his father. "Really sick, Dad. And he's been too proud to ask for help, but he needs help. He needs family." Robert's face might have been carved from stone. "What kind of help?" "Medical help and other kinds of help. He's living in this terrible place, Dad, this boarding house, where the heat doesn't work and the plumbing is broken and there's nobody who cares if he lives or dies." Margaret watched her husband's internal struggle play out across his features. The anger was still there, but it was competing now with information that challenged his carefully constructed narrative about Michael's choices and consequences. "He made his bed," Robert said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Maybe he did, but he's still your brother, and he's still sick, and he's still family, and I think maybe he's been waiting for someone to care enough to come find him." Tommy's voice broke slightly on the last words, revealing the 17-year-old boy beneath the young man's determination. He'd spent his morning confronting adult problems with adult complexity, but he was still young enough to believe that love could solve anything if it was applied with sufficient determination. "What exactly did you find when you went there?" Margaret asked gently. Tommy looked at her with gratitude, recognizing an ally in what had felt like a room full of judges. He's really thin, Mum. And he coughs all the time. This deep cough that sounds like it's coming from somewhere it shouldn't. And his room." He paused, searching for words that could convey what he'd witnessed. "It's not a place where people get better. It's a place where people go to give up." Robert closed his eyes briefly, and Margaret could see him fighting the same battle she'd been fighting for 2 years. The tension between protective anger and protective love, between the desire to help and the fear of being hurt again. "Did you talk to him?" Robert asked. "Yes, sir, for about 2 hours. We sat in this little coffee shop downtown and he told me things about Korea and about what it was like when he came home and about why he couldn't stay here anymore." "What kinds of things?" Tommy glanced at Susan and Danny, clearly struggling with how much family history should be shared in front of younger ears. Margaret made the decision for him. "Susan, why don't you take Danny upstairs and help him organize his baseball cards? Your father and Tommy need to talk privately. But I want to hear about Uncle Michael, Danny protested. I remember him. He taught me how to tie my shoes the special way. You can hear more later, Margaret said firmly. Right now this is grown-up conversation. Susan gathered Danny with the resignation of someone who had learned to accept exclusion from adult mysteries, though her expression suggested she intended to eavesdrop from the top of the stairs. When they were gone, Robert settled into his favorite armchair and gestured for Tommy to take the sofa. All right, son, tell me what Michael said. Tommy took a deep breath and began talking. He told them about finding Michael's boarding house, about the smell of disinfectant and despair that permeated the hallways, about the tiny room with its single window that looked out on an alley where garbage cans overflowed and stray cats picked through the debris. He told them about Michael's appearance, the weight loss that made his clothes hang like sacks, the tremor in his hands that got worse when he thought people were watching, the way he jumped at unexpected noises, as if he were still expecting mortar shells or sniper fire. But mostly, he told them about the conversation they'd had in Rosie's coffee shop on 5th Street, where Michael had finally talked about Korea in ways he'd never been able to do with his brother. About the things he'd seen and done and failed to do, about the friends who'd died in his arms, and the enemies he'd killed in moments of clarity so sharp they still woke him up at night. About coming home to a country that wanted to celebrate his service while forgetting about the cost of that service. He said he tried to be normal when he came back, Tommy said, his voice steady, but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He said he tried to pretend that nothing had changed, that he could just pick up where he left off before the war. But everything had changed, Dad. He had changed, in ways that couldn't be changed back. Robert listened without interruption, his face cycling through emotions that Margaret recognized but couldn't name. She'd seen some of these same expressions during the early years of their marriage, when Robert would wake from nightmares about Normandy and sit by the window until dawn, smoking cigarettes and watching the peaceful street as if he couldn't quite believe in its reality. He said the drinking started as medicine, Tommy continued, a way to stop the dreams, to make the sounds stop, to feel like he could be around people without wanting to hurt them or protect them or run away from them. And you believed him? Robert's voice was careful, neutral. I believed that he believed it, whether it's true or not. I don't know. But I know he's sick, Dad. Really sick. And I know he's ashamed of being sick. And the shame is making everything worse. Margaret watched her husband absorb this information, seeing him struggle with the collision between his own carefully constructed understanding of Michael's situation and the reality his son had discovered. Robert had spent 2 years justifying his decision to cut contact with his brother, building a narrative in which Michael's problems were the result of choices rather than circumstances, character flaws rather than genuine illness. But Tommy's account challenged those justifications in ways that were difficult to dismiss. Here was first-hand testimony from someone who had no agenda beyond family loyalty, someone young enough to see the situation without the complicated overlay of adult pride and disappointment. What does he want from us? Robert asked finally. Nothing, Tommy said quietly. That's the thing, Dad. He doesn't want anything. He's not asking for money or a place to stay or even for you to forgive him. He's just dying quietly, and he thinks that's what he deserves. The words hit Robert like physical blows. Margaret could see him flinch, could see the careful walls he'd built around his guilt beginning to crack under the weight of information he wasn't prepared to handle. But I think he needs us anyway, Tommy continued. I think he needs to know that his family hasn't given up on him completely, even if he's given up on himself. Robert stood abruptly and walked to the front window, his back to his wife and son. Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he stared out at the Sunday afternoon tranquility of Maple Street. Your uncle and I, we had words when he left here. Harsh words. Things were said that can't be unsaid. I know, Tommy said gently. He told me. He said he was angry and you were angry. And both of you said things you meant in the moment, but probably wish you hadn't said later. What else did he tell you? Tommy hesitated, clearly weighing his uncle's confidences against his family's need to understand. He said you offered him everything you could think of, money, work, a place to live, even help getting medical treatment. And he said he threw it all back at you because accepting help felt like admitting he was broken, and he wasn't ready to admit that. Robert's shoulders sagged slightly. He wasn't the only one who wasn't ready to admit things. Margaret rose from her chair and crossed the room to stand beside her husband. After 20 years of marriage, she knew when he needed physical proximity to anchor him during emotional storms. He said something else too, Tommy continued, his voice soft. He said he understood why you couldn't keep trying forever. He said you had your own family to protect, and he didn't blame you for choosing us over him. But you blame me. It wasn't a question. No, sir, I don't blame you. But I think maybe there's a difference between choosing your family over someone and choosing your family and someone. And I think Uncle Michael might be worth trying one more time. The silence that followed was heavy with possibilities and dangers, with the weight of decisions that would affect not just the immediate moment, but the future shape of their family's ability to handle crisis and complexity. Finally, Robert turned around to face them both. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his voice was steady when he spoke. All right, we'll go see him. Together as a family, but I want ground rules, and I want them clear from the beginning. Margaret felt her heart lift with a combination of relief and apprehension. This was Robert making a decision, stepping into leadership in the way she'd seen him do during wartime, when circumstances demanded action despite incomplete information. What kind of ground rules? Tommy asked. First, we approach this as a family decision, not as individual guilt or individual rescue missions. We're all in this together, or we're not in it at all. Tommy nodded seriously. Second, we acknowledge that Michael is an adult who has to want help before we can provide it effectively. We can offer support, but we can't force recovery. Yes, sir. Third, we protect Susan and Danny from the worst of whatever we might find. They deserve to know their uncle, but they don't need to be traumatized by adult problems they can't understand or solve. Margaret squeezed Robert's hand. Agreed. And fourth, Robert paused, his voice catching slightly. Fourth, we all understand that this might not work out the way we hope it will. Michael may not be able to accept help, or the help we can provide may not be enough. If that happens, we'll face it together, but we won't let it destroy what we've built here. Tommy stood up and crossed the room to his father, offering his hand in the formal way that men used to seal important agreements. Robert clasped his son's hand and pulled him into a brief, fierce hug that conveyed everything they couldn't say aloud about love and pride, and the terrible complexity of family loyalty. When do we go see him? Tommy asked when they separated. Robert checked his watch, a gesture that had become automatic after 20 years of factory supervision, where timing meant the difference between efficiency and chaos. Today's Sunday. Michael may not be at his best on Sunday afternoons. We'll go tomorrow evening after work and school. That gives us time to prepare Susan and Danny, and time for me to adjust my thinking about what we might be walking into. Margaret understood the subtext. Robert needed time to shift from 2 years of protective anger to whatever emotional stance would be required for reconciliation. He needed time to prepare himself for seeing his brother reduced to whatever state Tommy had discovered. Time to practice the kind of unconditional love that might be necessary. I'll call in sick tomorrow, she said. Mrs. Peterson can cover my shift at the church office. Family comes first. Robert nodded gratefully. Margaret's presence would provide the kind of emotional buffer that might make difficult conversations possible. She had a gift for creating safe spaces where people could reveal their vulnerabilities without losing their dignity. What do we tell Susan and Danny? Tommy asked. The truth, Robert said firmly, or as much of the truth as they can handle. They're old enough to understand that family members sometimes get sick in ways that aren't easy to fix, and that loving someone sometimes means accepting help even when you'd rather handle problems on your own. This was Robert at his best, Margaret thought, facing complex situations with clarity and moral courage, making decisions that balanced practical considerations with ethical imperatives. It was the man she'd fallen in love with 20 years ago, the man who had emerged from the war damaged but not destroyed, determined to build something good and strong despite having seen the worst of human nature. Should I go upstairs and talk to Susan and Danny now? She asked. Robert nodded. Tell them we're going to visit their Uncle Michael tomorrow and that he's been sick but is still family. Answer their questions honestly, but don't volunteer information that might frighten them unnecessarily. Margaret kissed his cheek a gesture that carried 20 years of gratitude and partnership, and headed upstairs to navigate the delicate process of preparing children for adult complications. Behind her, she could hear Robert and Tommy beginning the kind of detailed planning conversation that men use to transform emotional decisions into practical action. She found Susan and Danny in Danny's room, ostensibly organizing baseball cards, but clearly engaged in intense speculation about the adult drama that had been unfolding downstairs. "Is Tommy in trouble?" Danny asked immediately. "No, sweetheart. Tommy isn't in trouble, but we need to talk about Uncle Michael." Susan looked up from the shoebox of cards she'd been pretending to sort. "Is he really sick?" "Yes, he is. He's been sick for a while, and we haven't been very good at helping him because sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be." This was the eternal challenge of parenthood, explaining adult failures and complexities to children who still believed that problems could be solved through the application of sufficient good intentions. "What kind of sick?" Danny asked with the literal curiosity of an 8-year-old who wanted precise information about the nature of medical emergencies. "Different kinds of sick. His body is sick, and his heart is sick, and his spirit is sick. Sometimes when people go through very difficult experiences, they need time and help to get better, just like when you have pneumonia or a broken bone." Susan absorbed this with the serious attention of someone who was beginning to understand that adult problems didn't always have clear solutions. Why hasn't he been getting help? Margaret sat on the edge of Danny's bed, gathering her thoughts. This was the crucial moment, the point where she could either provide answers that satisfied their curiosity without overwhelming them, or complicate their understanding of family dynamics in ways that might create more anxiety than understanding. Sometimes people who are hurt feel ashamed of being hurt, and the shame makes it hard for them to ask for help. And sometimes the people who love them aren't sure how to help, so they end up waiting for things to get better on their own, instead of figuring out how to help together. "But that doesn't work, does it?" Susan said, with the insight that sometimes startled Margaret with its clarity. "No, sweetheart, it doesn't work. That's why we're going to go see Uncle Michael tomorrow and figure out how to help him now." Danny looked puzzled. If we knew how to help him, why didn't we help him before? Margaret felt the weight of 2 years' worth of family decisions, the accumulated consequences of choices made in anger and pride and fear. Because sometimes adults make mistakes, honey. Sometimes we let our hurt feelings get in the way of doing what we know is right. And sometimes we have to be brave enough to admit we were wrong and try again. This seemed to satisfy Danny's need for logical explanations, though Susan's expression suggested she was processing implications that extended beyond the immediate situation. "Will Uncle Michael be living with us again?" Susan asked. "I don't know yet. That depends on what Uncle Michael needs and what our family can provide. But we're going to find out together, and whatever we decide, we'll decide as a family." Susan nodded solemnly. At 14, she was old enough to understand that family loyalty sometimes required sacrifices, that love wasn't always convenient or easy. "I remember when he taught me to braid friendship bracelets," she said quietly. "He said I had artistic fingers. And he taught me the special knot for my shoelaces," Danny added, "the one that never comes untied." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. These were the memories that had sustained Tommy's determination to reconnect with his uncle. Not abstract concepts about family duty, but specific recollections of kindness and attention, moments when Michael had made his niece and nephew feel special and valued. "He loves you both very much," she said. "Even when he's been sick, even when he's been away from us, he's never stopped loving you." "How do you know?" Danny asked with the skepticism of someone who was learning to distinguish between what adults hoped was true and what actually was true. Because that's what family love is like. It doesn't depend on being in the same place or seeing each other every day. It's something that stays with you even when everything else changes. This was the faith that had sustained her own determination to keep track of Michael's whereabouts, to ensure that family connections remained available even when they couldn't be actively maintained. Love as a constant rather than a variable, commitment as something deeper than convenience. "Tomorrow after school we'll all go visit Uncle Michael together," she told them. "It might be a little sad because he's been sick for a long time. But it will also be good because families belong together, especially when someone needs help." Susan stood up from the floor where she'd been sitting, cross-legged among the baseball cards. "Should we bring him something? Like flowers or cookies or something?" Margaret's heart swelled with pride at her daughter's instinctive understanding of how to approach difficult situations with grace and generosity. "I think that would be lovely, sweetheart. Maybe we could bake his favorite cookies this evening." "Oatmeal chocolate chip," Danny said immediately. "I remember. He always asked for extra chocolate chips." "Then oatmeal chocolate chip it is." Margaret kissed each of her children and left them to finish their baseball card organization, though she suspected their attention would now be focused on tomorrow's visit and what it might mean for their family's future. Children had their own ways of preparing for emotional challenges, their own rituals for processing adult complexities. Downstairs, she found Robert and Tommy still talking quietly in the living room, their conversation having evolved from immediate planning to broader questions about family responsibility and the nature of redemption. "Everything all right upstairs?" Robert asked. "They're good children with good hearts. They remember Michael with love, and they want to help." Susan suggested we bring cookies, she added, "oatmeal chocolate chip." Robert smiled for the first time since Tommy's return. Michael always did have a sweet tooth. "Still does, apparently," Tommy said. He ordered 3 pieces of pie at the coffee shop. This detail seemed to reassure Robert in ways that more significant information hadn't. The persistence of simple preferences suggested that the essential Michael still existed beneath whatever damage time and circumstances had inflicted. "All right then," Robert said, standing up with the decisive movement of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. "Tomorrow we go see Michael. Tonight we bake cookies and prepare ourselves for whatever we might find." Margaret watched her husband embrace their son again, this time with the relaxed affection of a man who no longer had to choose between protecting his family and honoring his obligations to extend family. The crisis that had begun with Tommy's secret departure had transformed into an opportunity for healing that none of them could have anticipated. But even as she felt relief at this resolution, Margaret remained aware that the most difficult part lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring them face to face with Michael's reality, with the accumulated consequences of 2 years of separation and silence. Tomorrow would test their newly renewed commitment to family inclusion against the practical challenges of dealing with serious illness and complicated emotional history. Tonight, though, was for preparation and hope. Tonight was for baking cookies and having the kinds of conversations that prepared families to face uncertainty together. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the living room floor and the Sunday evening ritual of family dinner approached, Margaret felt that they had turned some crucial corner. Not toward easy resolution. She was too experienced to believe that family problems could be solved with simple goodwill, but toward the kind of honest engagement that made resolution possible. The kitchen filled with the warm sense of butter and brown sugar as the family worked together to create something sweet for Michael's homecoming. And outside, the Sunday evening peace of Cedar Grove settled over Maple Street like a blessing, holding them all in its gentle embrace as they prepared to expand their definition of home to include one more broken soul who needed healing. The boarding house on 5th Street stood like a monument to diminished expectations. 3 stories of tired brick and peeling paint, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years, and a front porch that sagged under the weight of too many lonely evenings. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die quietly, where people learned to measure hope in very small increments. Robert parked the family Buick at the curb and turned off the engine. For a moment, they all sat in silence, absorbing the reality of where Michael had been living for the past 2 years. The contrast with their own tree-lined street was stark enough to make everyone uncomfortable, not just because of the visible decay, but because of what that decay represented about the distance that had grown between their 2 worlds. "It's not as bad on the inside," Tommy said quietly, though his voice suggested even he wasn't entirely convinced by this reassurance. Margaret adjusted the tin of oatmeal chocolate chip cookies on her lap and checked her appearance in the car's side mirror. She'd chosen her clothes carefully, nice enough to show respect, practical enough to suggest she was prepared for whatever they might encounter. The blue dress with the white collar that made her look like the kind of woman who could handle crisis with grace and competence. Susan sat between her parents in the front seat, wearing the pink dress from yesterday's church service and carrying a small bouquet of daffodils from their backyard garden. At 14, she possessed an instinctive understanding of how to bring beauty into places that had forgotten what beauty looked like. Danny bounced slightly in the back seat beside Tommy, his excitement at seeing Uncle Michael again tempered by the solemnity of the adults around him. He clutched a carefully wrapped package, his most prized baseball card, the Mickey Mantle rookie card that he'd been saving for a special occasion. If Uncle Michael was sick, Danny reasoned with 8-year-old logic, then a special present might help him get better. "Remember what we talked about," Robert said, his voice carrying the gentle authority he used when preparing his children for situations that might test their emotional resources. "Uncle Michael may look different than you remember. He's been sick, and sometimes being sick changes people in ways we can see and ways we can't see." "We understand, Daddy," Susan said solemnly. "And we're here together as a family. Whatever we find, we face it together." Margaret reached over and squeezed her husband's hand, feeling the slight tremor that always appeared when he was preparing himself for emotional difficulty. 20 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the signs of Robert's internal battles, the way he straightened his shoulders and set his jaw when forcing himself to do things that frightened him. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Robert nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the boarding house's shabby facade. As ready as anyone can be for something like this. They climbed out of the car and arranged themselves on the sidewalk, Robert leading the way with the determined stride of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through, Margaret beside him carrying the cookies and radiating the kind of calm competence that could stabilize any situation, Tommy and Susan flanking Danny in a protective formation that suggested they understood their younger brother might need extra support. The front porch creaked ominously under their collective weight. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing a narrow hallway that smelled of disinfectant and boiled cabbage and something else that might have been despair made manifest. "Room 312, Tommy said quietly. "Third floor, at the end of the hall." They climbed the stairs in single file, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell despite their attempts to move quietly. The walls were painted institutional green, a color that had probably been chosen for its ability to hide dirt, but had succeeded mainly in making everything look slightly sick. On the second-floor landing, they passed an old woman in a faded house dress who watched their progress with the sharp curiosity of someone for whom other people's business provided the primary entertainment. She nodded politely to Margaret, but studied the children with particular attention, as if trying to determine what kind of family emergency would bring well-dressed people to this particular address. The third-floor hallway was dimmer than the floors below, lit by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows and made everyone's face look gaunt and worried. The smell of disinfectant was stronger here, fighting a losing battle against odors that spoke of too many people living too close together with too little hope. Room 312 was at the far end of the hall, its door painted the same institutional green as the walls, but chipped and scarred in ways that suggested either violence or simple neglect. Tommy paused in front of it, his hand raised to knock, then looked back at his family, as if giving them one last chance to change their minds. Robert stepped forward and knocked himself. 3 firm raps that announced serious intent without suggesting emergency. "Michael, it's Robert." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then they heard movement inside the room, slow, cautious, the sound of someone who wasn't accustomed to unexpected visitors and wasn't sure whether to be hopeful or alarmed. "Robert." The voice that came through the door was Michael's, but changed, rougher, more uncertain, as if he'd spent so long talking only to himself that he'd forgotten how to project words toward other people. "Yes, I'm here with Margaret and the kids. Can we come in?" Another pause, longer this time, filled with what might have been preparation or panic, or simply the effort required to make a decision that felt impossibly complex. The door opened slowly, revealing Michael Gallagher in the harsh light of the hallway's single bulb. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Tommy had tried to prepare them, but no description could have conveyed the full impact of seeing Michael reduced to this shadow of his former self. He had always been the larger of the two brothers, broader in the shoulders, more commanding in his presence, the kind of man who filled doorways and dominated rooms simply by existing in them. But the man who opened the door to room 312 looked as if he'd been systematically diminished by forces too powerful to resist. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost at least 30 pounds, his face was gaunt and pale, and his hands shook with a tremor that could have been nerves or withdrawal or simple malnutrition. But his eyes were still Michael's eyes, still holding the intelligence and kindness that had made him such a beloved uncle, though now they also held a wariness that spoke of too many disappointments and too few reasons to trust in good outcomes. "Jesus," he whispered, taking in the sight of his brother's family arranged in the narrow hallway like some kind of miracle he wasn't sure he deserved. "You came. You all came." "Of course we came," Robert said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of emotion that made it clear this reunion was costing him considerable effort. "Your family." Michael stepped back from the doorway, gesturing them into a room that was exactly as Tommy had described. Small, dim, furnished with cast-off pieces that had seen better decades. But it was clean, Margaret noticed with relief. However reduced Michael's circumstances had become, he was still maintaining basic standards of hygiene and order. "I wasn't expecting," Michael began, then stopped, apparently overwhelmed by the logistics of hosting 5 people in a space designed for solitary existence. "We brought cookies," Danny announced, his 8-year-old directness cutting through the adult awkwardness like a knife through butter. "Oatmeal chocolate chip with extra chocolate chips, just like you used to like." Michael's face transformed as he looked down at his youngest nephew, the wariness replaced by something that might have been joy or relief or simple wonder at being remembered for something as basic as cookie preferences. "Extra chocolate chips," he repeated softly, crouching down to Danny's eye level. "You remembered." "Of course I remembered. And I brought you this." Danny thrust the wrapped baseball card forward with the ceremonial gravity of someone presenting a gift that represented significant personal sacrifice. Michael unwrapped the package with hands that trembled slightly, revealing the Mickey Mantle card in all its pristine glory. For a moment, he just stared at it, as if he couldn't quite process the magnitude of what an 8-year-old boy had just given him. "Danny," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "this is your most valuable card. I know, but you're sick, and sick people need special presents to help them get better." Michael looked up at Robert and Margaret over Danny's head, his eyes bright with tears that he wasn't quite managing to control. This was the gift that children could give to adult situations, the ability to cut straight to the emotional heart of complex problems, to respond with pure love instead of complicated analysis. "Thank you," he said to Danny. "This is the most special present anyone's ever given me." Susan stepped forward with her bouquet of daffodils, suddenly shy in the face of her uncle's obvious emotion. "These are from our garden," she said softly. "Mama says daffodils mean new beginnings." "They're beautiful, sweetheart." Michael accepted the flowers with the same reverence he'd shown Danny's baseball card. "Just like their mama." This drew a smile from Susan and a soft laugh from Margaret, breaking some of the tension that had been building in the small room. Michael arranged the daffodils in a water glass on his windowsill, where they immediately transformed the dingy space with their bright yellow cheerfulness. "Sit down, please," Michael said, gesturing toward the room's limited seating options. "I'm sorry I don't have much to offer you." "We're not here for the accommodations," Robert said with a slight smile. "We're here for you." Margaret arranged herself on the room's single chair, while the others found places on the bed and the wooden crate that served as Michael's coffee table. The physical closeness required by the cramped space actually helped, she realized. It made the conversation feel more intimate, more like a family gathering than a formal intervention. "Tommy told us you've been having some health problems," she said gently, employing the kind of diplomatic language that allowed difficult topics to be approached gradually. Michael nodded, his attention focused on his hands, which continued to tremble slightly, despite his obvious efforts to control them. "Some problems, yeah, nothing that can't be managed." "What kind of problems?" Robert's question was direct but not aggressive, the tone of someone seeking information rather than making judgments. Michael was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much truth to reveal to an audience that included his teenage and child niece and nephew. Finally, he looked up at Robert with the kind of direct eye contact that suggested he had decided on complete honesty, regardless of the consequences. "The kind of problems that come from trying to solve other problems with a bottle," he said simply, "and the kind of problems that come from ignoring the bottle problems until they turn into medical problems." Susan and Danny absorbed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to adult confessions. They might not understand all the implications, but they could recognize honesty when they heard it, and honesty felt safer than the mysterious adult silences they'd been navigating for years. "Are you getting treatment?" Margaret asked. "Can't afford treatment, and—" Michael paused, searching for words that could convey the complicated shame that surrounded addiction and mental health issues in 1960. "And even if I could afford it, I'm not sure I'd know how to ask for it. It's not exactly the kind of thing they teach you in the army." Robert leaned forward slightly, his expression showing the kind of focused attention that indicated he was shifting into problem-solving mode. What would treatment look like if money weren't an issue? "There's a place over in Hamilton County, a hospital that specializes in people like me, people who came back from overseas with problems they can't seem to solve on their own." Michael's voice was carefully neutral, as if he were discussing someone else's situation rather than his own desperate circumstances. "What kind of place?" Tommy asked. "Clean place. Medical supervision for getting off the bottle safely. Counseling for the other stuff. The nightmares, the jumping at loud noises, the feeling like you're never quite sure if the ground under your feet is real or not." Margaret felt her heart break a little at this description. She'd seen some of these symptoms in Robert during the early years of their marriage, though never to the extent that Michael was describing. The difference, she realized, was that Robert had come home to a support system, a wife who loved him, a job that gave him purpose, a future that felt worth building toward. Michael had come home to expectations he couldn't meet and guilt he couldn't process, and had been too proud to ask for help until asking felt impossible. "How much would this place cost?" Robert asked, his tone suggesting he was already calculating possibilities. "More than I have. More than I could earn, even if I could hold down steady work." Michael managed a weak smile. "It's not exactly charity work, and insurance doesn't cover problems that start in your head instead of your body." Robert was quiet for several minutes, his face cycling through the kinds of calculations that men made when faced with problems that required both emotional and financial resources. Margaret could see him weighing options, considering possibilities, preparing to make the kind of decision that would commit their family to a course of action with uncertain outcomes. "We'll find a way to manage the money," he said finally. "The important question is whether you want to try." Michael's laugh was bitter, self-aware. "Want to try? Robert, I've been wanting to try for 2 years. Wanting to try is about all I've been good at. I mean really try, with support, with family backing you up, with the understanding that recovery isn't something you have to do alone." Michael looked around the room at his brother's family, at Margaret's calm competence, at Tommy's earnest determination, at Susan's gentle beauty, at Danny's innocent faith in the power of love to fix anything. They represented everything he'd lost, everything he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve, everything he'd been too ashamed to reach toward. "You'd do that?" he asked quietly. "After everything that happened between us? After the things I said?" "Michael," Robert said, his voice carrying 20 years of brotherly love and 2 years of regret, "we should have done it 2 years ago. I should have understood that pride and stubbornness aren't the same thing as strength, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help. I wasn't ready to admit that 2 years ago. Are you ready now?" Michael looked at Danny, who was studying the room with the frank curiosity of someone cataloging details to share later, and at Susan, who was discreetly trying to make the daffodils look more artistic in their improvised vase, and at Tommy, who was watching this adult conversation with the satisfaction of someone whose gamble had paid off better than he'd dared hope. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I'm ready now." Margaret felt tears threaten at the edges of her vision. This was what she'd been hoping for during those 2 years of secret vigil, the moment when pride would finally surrender to necessity, and family love would prove stronger than family anger. "What happens next?" Susan asked, with the practical curiosity that teenage girls brought to adult decision-making. "Next, we make some phone calls," Robert said, with the decisive tone that indicated he was already formulating concrete plans. "We find out exactly what this Hamilton County place requires, how long the treatment takes, and what kind of support Michael will need during and after. And next, I try to figure out how to be someone worth all this effort," Michael said quietly. "You're already worth it," Danny said matter-of-factly. "Your family is always worth it." This simple pronouncement from an 8-year-old seemed to settle something for Michael. as if Danny's uncomplicated certainty provided an anchor point in a situation that felt overwhelmingly complex. "There's something else we need to talk about," Margaret said gently. "Where you'll stay while we're making these arrangements, this place." She gestured around the small room. "This place isn't helping you get better." Michael nodded, acknowledging the truth of what she wasn't quite saying directly, that room 312 was the kind of environment where people went to disappear, not to recover. "I can't come back to Maple Street," he said quickly. "Not yet. There's too much history there. Too many ways I could disappoint you all again." "What about Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Elm Street?" Tommy suggested. "It's nicer than this place, but it's not. It's not home if you need some space to figure things out." Robert considered this proposal with the careful attention he brought to all practical problems. Mrs. Henderson ran a respectable boarding house that catered to factory workers and traveling salesmen, clean, well-maintained, close enough to provide family support, but separate enough to allow Michael the independence he seemed to need. "That might work," he said slowly, "as a temporary solution while we get the medical treatment arranged." "I'll pay you back," Michael said immediately. "Every cent. I'll get a job, get back on my feet, pay you back with interest." "Michael," Margaret said firmly, "we're not doing this as a loan. We're doing this as family. The only payment we want is for you to get well and stay well." Michael's eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "I don't know how to thank you. I don't know how to." "You don't have to know," Robert said, standing up and extending his hand to his brother. "You just have to try." Michael stood as well, accepting Robert's handshake, and then being pulled into the kind of fierce, awkward hug that men used when emotions threatened to overwhelm their capacity for verbal expression. 20 years of brotherhood, 2 years of separation, and countless nights of mutual worry and regret were compressed into that single embrace. When they separated, both brothers' eyes were bright with tears, but their faces showed the kind of relief that came with finally addressing problems that had been too big to handle alone. "So," Michael said, attempting to restore some lightness to the emotional atmosphere, "tell me what I've missed. What's been happening in the Gallagher household while I've been having my extended vacation from reality?" This invitation to normalcy was exactly what everyone needed. For the next hour, the cramped room filled with the comfortable chatter of family catching up, Tommy's football season and his plans for college, Susan's musical achievements and her secret dreams of performing, Danny's baseball card collection, and his theories about why Mickey Mantle was better than Ted Williams. Margaret watched her husband and his brother rediscover their ability to talk to each other about ordinary things, saw the way Michael's face brightened as he absorbed news about his nieces' and nephews' lives. This was what healing looked like in its early stages. Not dramatic transformation, but the gradual restoration of connection, the careful rebuilding of relationships that had been damaged by circumstances too complex for easy resolution. When it was time to leave, they made concrete plans for the following day. Robert would call the Hamilton County facility to inquire about admission procedures. Margaret would contact Mrs. Henderson about room availability. Tommy would help Michael pack his few belongings and coordinate the move to better accommodations. "One more thing," Michael said as they prepared to leave. He reached into his dresser drawer and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I've been saving this for if I ever had the chance to give it to someone who might want it." He handed the package to Susan, who unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small silver locket on a delicate chain. "It was your grandmother's," Michael said softly. "Robert's and my mother. She always said it should go to the first Gallagher girl who was old enough to appreciate it." Susan opened the locket to find 2 tiny photographs, one of their grandmother as a young woman, one of their grandfather in his World War I uniform. The kind of family treasure that connected past and present, that made personal history feel tangible and meaningful. "It's beautiful," Susan whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Family treasures should stay with family, and you're definitely old enough to appreciate what it represents." Margaret helped Susan fasten the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of family continuity and the promise of family healing. This was how recovery happened, not through dramatic gestures, but through the gradual restoration of normal family rituals, the sharing of stories and gifts and ordinary affection. As they prepared to leave, Michael walked them to the door of his small room. standing in the doorway as if he couldn't quite believe they had actually come, actually stayed, actually committed to helping him find his way back to family and health. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on me even when I'd given up on myself." "That's what family does," Robert replied. "We hold on to each other, especially when holding on feels impossible." The drive home was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of people who had accomplished something difficult and important together. The children dozed in the back seat, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the afternoon. Margaret watched the familiar streets of Cedar Grove pass by the car windows and felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because their problems were solved, but because they were finally facing their problems honestly as a family. "That was harder than I expected," Robert said quietly, his voice barely audible over the car's engine. "But good hard, not bad hard," Margaret replied. "Yeah, good hard." When they reached Maple Street, the early evening light was slanting through the trees in the particular way that made ordinary suburban streets look like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. Other families were settling into their Monday evening routines, children playing on front lawns, mothers calling them in for dinner, fathers returning from work with newspapers tucked under their arms. It was the America they had all been fighting to preserve and protect, the vision of stability and prosperity and family happiness that had sustained them through war and economic uncertainty, and the thousand small crises that tested their faith in the future. But now that vision felt different, more complex and more honest. It included room for family members who struggled with problems that couldn't be solved through hard work and good intentions alone. It acknowledged that sometimes the strongest families were the ones that learned how to hold space for weakness, that sometimes the most successful lives were the ones that included room for failure and redemption. That night, as Margaret tucked Danny into bed, he asked the question that had been troubling him since their visit to Uncle Michael's boarding house. "Mama, why did Uncle Michael get so sick when Daddy came back from the war and didn't get sick?" Margaret sat on the edge of his bed, choosing her words carefully. This was one of those questions that children asked with perfect innocence, but that required answers complex enough to satisfy adult understanding while remaining simple enough for child comprehension. "Sometimes people who go through the same difficult experiences react differently," she said finally. "Daddy was lucky. He had family waiting for him, and a job, and a future that felt hopeful. Uncle Michael came home to different circumstances, and he didn't have the same support system to help him heal. But he has us now. Yes, sweetheart, he has us now. And we're going to help him get better. We're going to try our very best to help him get better. But you know what? Even if he doesn't get completely better, even if he always has some problems, he'll still be our uncle, and we'll still love him." Danny absorbed this with the serious attention he brought to important concepts, because that's what families do. That's exactly what families do. After kissing Danny goodnight and turning off his bedroom light, Margaret found Robert sitting in their bedroom, staring out the window at the evening shadows gathering across their backyard. He looked tired but peaceful, like a man who had finally made peace with a decision that had been weighing on him for too long. "How are you feeling about everything?" she asked, settling beside him on the bed. "Scared," he said honestly, "and hopeful, and guilty about waiting so long to do what we should have done 2 years ago. We did what we thought was right at the time, with the information we had. That's all anyone can do. I know, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things." Margaret took his hand, feeling the calluses from 20 years of factory work, and the slight tremor that still appeared when he was emotionally overwhelmed. "Michael's going to be all right," she said softly. "It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but he's going to be all right. He has something now that he didn't have before." "What's that?" "Hope, and family support, and the understanding that he doesn't have to face his problems alone." Robert nodded, squeezing her hand gratefully. "Thank you." "For what?" "For keeping track of him when I couldn't, for protecting our family while still making room for him to come back to it, for being wise enough to know the difference between enabling someone's problems and abandoning someone who needs help." Margaret felt tears threaten at the edges of her vision. This was the conversation they should have had 2 years ago, the acknowledgement of the impossible choices that love sometimes required. "We're good together," she said simply. "We balance each other out." "Yeah, we do." They sat in comfortable silence, as the evening light faded into full darkness, holding hands and watching the familiar rituals of their neighborhood settling into nighttime quiet. Porch lights coming on, television broadcasts beginning, the sounds of children being called inside for baths and bedtime stories. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, phone calls to treatment facilities, practical arrangements for Michael's care, the ongoing work of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by circumstances too complex for easy resolution. But tonight, they could rest in the satisfaction of having finally done the right thing, of having chosen family love over family anger. The next few months would test their commitment in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Michael's recovery would prove to be a longer, more complicated process than any of them anticipated, with setbacks and breakthroughs that would challenge their faith in the possibility of healing. There would be difficult conversations about money and expectations, about the difference between supporting someone's recovery and enabling their dependence. But the foundation they had rebuilt today, the acknowledgement that family love was stronger than family disappointment, that redemption was possible even when it seemed too late, would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months later, Margaret would stand in the kitchen of their house on Maple Street, preparing Sunday breakfast with the same care and attention she had always brought to family rituals. But now the breakfast would be for 6 people instead of 5, and the conversation around the table would include Michael's steady voice contributing to discussions about politics and baseball, and the 1,000 small details that comprised ordinary family life. By then, Michael would have successfully completed his treatment program and found steady work at a manufacturing plant in the next county. He would be living in his own apartment, maintaining his sobriety one day at a time, slowly rebuilding his sense of himself as someone worthy of love and respect. He would never be completely free from the shadows that Korea had left in his mind, but he would learn to live with those shadows instead of being controlled by them. He would develop the tools and support systems that made recovery not just possible, but sustainable. And on Sunday mornings, when the whole family gathered around the breakfast table to share coffee and eggs and the week's news, he would look around at his brother's wife and children and feel the kind of gratitude that went deeper than words. Gratitude for second chances, for family loyalty, for the miraculous possibility that people could change, that love could indeed triumph over fear and pride and the complicated legacy of war. But all of that lay in the future. Tonight, as Margaret and Robert prepared for sleep in their familiar bedroom, they could only hope and plan and commit themselves to the long work of healing that stretched ahead. The radio played softly from the kitchen downstairs, Perry Como singing about catching falling stars and putting them in your pocket, never letting them fade away. The same song that had been playing that morning, which now seemed like years ago instead of hours. Margaret smiled at the coincidence, at the way music could bracket experiences and make them feel complete, like chapters in a story that had definite beginnings and endings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new chapters in the ongoing story of family love and family healing. But tonight, falling stars felt like promises instead of wishes, hope instead of longing. Tonight, the Gallagher family was whole again, ready to face whatever the future might hold with the strength that came from facing it together. Outside, Cedar Grove settled into the peaceful rhythms of a Monday night in May 1960, secure in the knowledge that some things, family, community, the possibility of redemption, were worth preserving and protecting, no matter how complicated the world became. The gentle sound of Perry Como's voice drifted up the stairs, carrying with it all the sweetness and melancholy of an America that was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to make room for complexity within its dreams of simplicity. An America where families like the Gallaghers could stumble and recover, break apart and come back together, stronger for having acknowledged that love required not perfection, but commitment, the daily choice to hold on to each other, especially when holding on felt impossible. Catch a falling star and put it in your pocket, never let it fade away. The song ended, but the promise it represented would endure, woven now into the fabric of a family that had learned the difference between hiding from pain and healing from it, between protecting themselves from difficulty and protecting each other through difficulty. In the quiet house on Maple Street, 5 people slept peacefully, dreaming of tomorrow's possibilities. And across town, In a small room that no longer felt quite so lonely, Michael Gallagher fell asleep holding his nephew's baseball card and listening to the sound of hope returning to his life like a long-lost friend. Sometimes one day really could carry the weight and beauty of an entire year.